Up next, we have Jeff Eickwort with the Florida Forest Service, and he is a supervisor of the Florida Forest Service Health Section, where he has worked since 2004. That is part of the agency responsible for issues related to pests, diseases, and invasive plants that impact forest and shade trees throughout the state. He also teaches as an adjunct professor for the forest health at the University of Florida. He earned his BS in forestry from Michigan State University and his MS in entomology from the University of Florida. With that, welcome, Jeff.
All right, thanks everybody. First of all, microphones hate me, and the feeling is mutual. If at any time I fade out, please flag me down. So yeah, I'm with the Forest Health section. I'm going to say right off the bat, in this room, I need to be clear. I am not a fire expert. There's tons of you here who know way more about fire than I do. I'm the one that they call in generally when something has gone wrong. And they've got trees dying after a fire. It could be a wildfire, prescribed fire. So that's the perspective I'm coming at it with. Some of this may be review for some of you. I really hope that even for the old timers here, you might learn a little bit something new about how pine bark beetles relate to fire. Oops, how does this work? Again. Yep. Sorry, folks. Ah, there you go. That'll work.
Now it works.
Okay. All right. So when we're talking about pine bark beetles, this is the way that you've probably seen this picture many times over the years if you've done any kind of forest health classes at all. We've got 5 important pine bark beetles in Florida. Important because they can be responsible for some part of the death of a tree. We've got like 80 out there that are only in trees after they're dead. That's like the normal bark beetle behavior. These guys are a little bit unusual because they can actually attack trees and be part of the process of killing them. So we have the 3 species up top, the Ips engraver beetles. I don't worry about the names, just remember small, medium, and large. And they tend to attack different heights on the tree. And then we have 2 species in Dendroctonus, the southern pine beetle, or SPB, and the black turpentine beetle, which is kind of its big cousin, or we often say BTB. So this arrangement on the screen is the way that entomologists like to think about them in order of how they're related. And for a lot of people, they just see this, kind of lump them all together and they say, I've got pine beetles. And what I want, one of the big takeaways I want you guys to get from this talk is that it's actually way more important than that to know which type of pine bark beetles you've got. I would say that for most management purposes, this is the most sensible way to think about it. You've got southern pine beetle, the one that can cause big outbreaks. It's a tree killer. Once it's going, it's like 5-alarm fire. You got to worry about it. And then you've got all of the rest. These stress responders that are kind of our bread and butter pine bark beetles as forest entomologists. They're always out there, always at work, but they're not as aggressive. So just to kind of hammer this point home before I go into the fire stuff, Ips, and again, Ips is just the name of the genus, IPS, it doesn't stand for anything, versus black turpentine, and black turpentine beetle, the stress responders versus southern pine beetle. With Ips and BTB, these are super common all the time, every year. Set me loose in a pine stand big enough, I will find a tree with these in them. Basically, wherever there are pine trees. And when a pine tree dies, anywhere in Florida or the Southeast, these guys will find it at some point of the process, almost always. And I'm saying I could cut down a pine tree in downtown Orlando, lay it down, walk away, come back a week later, these guys will have found it. They are always out there. They will fly for miles to find that scent of a tree in trouble. Whereas southern pine beetle, most years, most places, it's actually pretty hard to find. We've had plenty of years where we look for it. We actually fly across the entire northern half of the state looking for southern pine beetle infestations. We've had years where not a single infestation was found in the state. That was true in 2020 and 2021. It was also actually true this year. While Georgia and Alabama were having major outbreaks, nothing. We haven't found a single one. believe it or not. And I will also add, it is never found in South Florida. If you work basically south of where we are right now, about a line ranging from Orlando across the state to Tampa, southern pine beetle does not exist south of that line. And that has to do with the presence of its preferred pine species, which is loblolly pine, which kind of drops out right about that line. So when you find Ips and black turpentine beetle, you interpret it as they are there because the tree was in trouble. It's an indication that the tree had something else going on with it, and they are responding to it. Whereas when you have a southern pine beetle outbreak, it's a beetle-driven issue. Once their population builds up, they can attack healthy trees. The trees don't have to be stressed anymore. They can move from tree to tree to tree, and it's like disaster, outbreak. Got to respond to it. Not true with Ips and black turpentine beetle. When we have disasters like hurricanes or major widespread wildfires, the stress responding beetles are the ones that tend to show up in the year or two following those events. Whereas that's not really true of southern pine beetle. That's often the concern. Oh, we just had a major hurricane. Are we going to get a lot of SPB? No, we don't generally see that. In fact, it's actually one of these things that even the old timer forest entomologists at meetings, they still bicker about because it's really not understood why southern pine beetle suddenly has outbreaks where and when it does versus any other place in any other year. We know a lot about how it behaves once it gets started. We don't know why it gets started, when and where it does. When we have Ips and black turpentine beetle, this is the part where people have they have trouble accepting it. Usually you don't need to control them. You don't need to do anything about it. And I'll go into a little bit further on why. Whereas with southern pine beetle, generally it's the opposite. If you have an active southern pine beetle infestation, you gotta get on it if you want to make sure that you're preventing further losses. And so again, with Ips and black turpentine, these stress responding pine bark beetles, you should ask, why are these trees so stressed out that these things are attacking? They're there for a reason. They're not going around attacking healthy trees all over the place. Whereas with southern pine beetle, if you find an active infestation, you got to, again, act or at least consider action. And so when I say action, what do I mean? With southern pine beetle, we're talking about suppression harvests. So as I'll go in a little bit more, southern pine beetle tends to spread in distinct spreading spots. And to stop that spread, generally you treat it kind of like a wildfire. You cut a buffer strip ahead of the direction that they're spreading, and then you cut out all of the infested pines inward from there to try to create a buffer so that they can kind of disperse instead of coordinating their attack to the next tree. You don't have to worry about removing the old dead trees. They no longer have beetles in them. You can leave them for the woodpeckers and the other natural enemies. So southern pine beetle uses pheromones to coordinate their mass attack. If you have a larger spacing in between trees, those smells that they use to signal each other tend to disperse, and that's why cutting this buffer strip, like a fire line, is often a good way to stop the spread. So this is what it can look like if you've got a really bad active infestation ripping through a plantation. They're cutting out that buffer ahead of the direction that the beetles were spreading from tree to tree, and then they're going to work in from there. Classic cut and remove suppression technique. With the stress responding pine bark beetles, again, just the opposite. People tend to want to go into a stand and say, I've got an infested tree here, I've got an infested tree there. They're scattered throughout. I'm going to send in logging crews to remove those so that they don't spread to nearby trees. Wrong approach. So these beetles, they are responding to the scent of a dying tree or a stressed out tree. If the nearby tree is perfectly happy and healthy, they will leave it alone, even if it's right next door. If the tree is so stressed out that it's attractive to these beetles, they will fly in from miles around to find it. So removing those individual infested trees is not really going to do anything for you in terms of pest control. What can happen is that you're causing more disturbance to the stand. You're moving equipment through, banging up some trees, and inevitably it happens. So you can actually make the problem worse through that kind of harvest disturbance. So what we usually tell people is, don't act right away. Watch and wait. These infestations tend to be self-limiting. They are responding to the stress trees. When those stress trees are either recovered or the beetles have gotten them all, it settles down on its own. with no action. And if on the other hand, you can't afford to lose any more trees, just economically, like I'm going to lose my shirt if I let these trees rot on the stump, choose the worst affected area and clear cut them as contiguous block rather than trying to pick and choose. And if it's in a ornamental setting, there's really no urgency in terms of pest control to remove them. It's just in terms of whether it's going to be a hazard to fall down on people or property. So how do you know? Well, okay, I should say part of the reason that this is the case is because trees fight back. It's not like having cockroaches in your house. They're just going to keep on building up. The house doesn't fight back. Pine trees do. And one of the main responses they have is the resin canals that they have going through all of their tissues. The inner bark, even the sapwood, it's this pressurized toxic resin that's like a booby trap running through all of the pine's inner tissues just for this reason, as a defense mechanism. So as the beetles tunnel in, they run into these pressurized resin vessels and it tries to flush them out. And often it does work. You may find the beetles stuck on the outside of those little pitch tubes, as we call them. If the beetle keeps on tunneling in and is able to overcome that defense, then you'll often end up with a little hole in the center of that resin blob. And that's the beetle's kind of success point, and that's why we call it a pitch tube, a hole in the center. It's very common to find a dead tree that's infested with pine bark beetles with no pitch tubes having formed through the process. What that is a clue telling you is that the tree was basically done when the beetles got there. It had no defenses at all. It was on death's door or already dead. And the beetles were just coming in to take advantage of the situation. Make sense? All right. Just so you know, the location and size of the pitch tubes can give you a clue as to which type you've got. So Ips and graver beetles, those pitch tubes tend to be around the size of maybe a popcorn kernel or smaller. And they tend to be kind of randomly scattered on the stem of the tree on the bark. Could be from top to bottom. Southern pine beetle, on the other hand, really prefers to attack in the crevices between bark plates. And so that can be a clue right off the bat that if you see them all running down up and down the bark plates and it's running up and down the length of the stem, oh, okay, you might want to take a closer look at that one. If on the other hand, it is only down at the base of the tree and they're big globby pitch tubes, that might be black turpentine beetle, another one of the stress responders. It's the biggest bark beetle and it can only attack near the base where the phloem layer is the thickest. So that middle version is really the only one that should be alarming to you. If you've got little popcorn-shaped kernels going up and down the stem, and they're in the bark crevices. Don't worry about the color of the pitch tubes. There's a lot of misinformation out there about that. That depends much more on the species of pine that's being attacked than the species of beetle that's doing the work. And if there's no resin response, so in this case, this is a tree that was cut down. And then again, they walked away, came back a couple days later. Ips were loading through it, tunneling in, but there's no resin pressure. So you may see that there's reddish brown crumbly boring dust being pushed out of their holes instead. So that's a common indicator, especially of Ips infestation. And you may see this on standing trees after a burn. It should be the beginning of your investigation, not the end of it. There are some other insects that sometimes like to chew on the bark of burned trees, but don't necessarily kill them. But this is one thing you can watch out for. So this is from a fun case. Next to our office, there's a natural area on campus. If any of you have been to UF campus, this is the natural area teaching lab. Where they do annual burns in this area of longleaf pine that they've been trying to restore over time. And one day, the morning after one of those burns, I came out and saw that they still had one of these live, mature longleaf pines that had this nice scar that was still burning at the base. Around about 10 o'clock, they finally got a poor undergraduate assistant out there with like a little pump sprayer to put it out. So this looks bad, right? And I have to say, I assumed at the outset that this is going to result in tree death eventually. This happened in May, all right. And sure enough, eventually we did start to see some bark beetle attacks at the base of the tree. It started on the left there with some crumbly boring dust at the crevices, just down at the base, which made me think, okay, probably black turpentine beetle. And because there's no real resin response, it's attacking parts of the tree that are already pretty much cooked. as you might expect. And then over time, we saw more and more pitch tubes and a little bit more resin around the circumference of the tree away from where it was actively burning. So my question for you guys, audience participation time. All right, so this burned about between the 17th and 18th of May. How long do you think it took for those first signs of bark beetle? Yeah.
24 hours.
24 hours. We got one from Ralph.
Yeah.
So, 12 hours? Anybody else? 3 days. Okay. So if this were Price is Right, you'd get the prize. Let's see if I can show up here. 3 months later. And I was by this tree like almost every day, like several times a week. I go by this tree. So I was checking it, and it took until 3 months later for the beetles to decide that this tree was stressed out enough and smelled yummy enough to the beetles to come and try to tunnel in. So my next audience participation question. Now you're all nervous. How long do you think it took for the crown to turn brown after the May burn? Oh.
6 months.
6 months. Oh man, see now you're all guessing way out. Okay. The correct answer was it's still green. I'll tell you when it happens. I just took this picture earlier this week, and it is still green. So this is I bring this up because it's an important point that people often get wrong. The wilting of the crown is the most visible thing you see from a distance, and it's usually the first thing that people notice. However, it's almost the last thing to occur in a bark beetle infestation. So when you're scouting and you see these red trees, those aren't fresh hits. And very often by the time you see that, the beetles have had time to attack, mate, lay eggs, the larvae have hatched, they've done their feeding through the phloem layer, they've pupated, and they've vacated the tree. All of that can easily happen, and very often does, before the tree turns brown. So when you're coming into it with seeing brown trees, you're actually coming into it way late in the process. And in fact, it may already pretty much have run its course. So just be aware of that. But we still do use this, and we will often use, if it is a southern pine beetle thing, we'll say, okay, those brown trees are old dead. Those trees that are just turning yellow over there, that's the direction that they've tended to spread. But if you look past that, you will usually see some green trees that may be attacked. And that's for me, that's the distinguishing factor. If you are investigating a situation, look for pitch tubes, those clumps of resin on trees that still have green crowns. That is much more likely to tell you that you've got an active bark beetle situation than just seeing the brown crowns. All right. So the relationship between pine bark beetles and fire is complicated. First of all, I just say right off the bat, because I sometimes get asked, can we control bark beetles with fire? No, unfortunately not. Any fire that's hot enough to kill those bark beetles that are already in trees will also cook your trees. So it's not really an option. But in terms of, how about prescribed fire, for example? The last thing I want is for anybody to walk away from this talk and call up to Tallahassee and say, you got Eickwort come down here saying prescribed fire is bad. No. Definitely not saying that. But it is a stressor. It is a short-term stressor on trees. And it's a long-term benefit in the stand, at this level of a stand. So if we're talking about, if you're an arborist and you're just looking at the health of an individual tree, fire can be stressful for that thing in the next year. But at the stand level, it's beneficial over the long term. So to the extent that you have a fire that stresses out trees, those stress-responding pine bark beetles will become more active. To the extent that you are improving the health of your stand on the long run, you'll have fewer and fewer problems with these pine bark beetles as a result. It sort of follows once you understand that they are stress responders. So in terms of post-burn pine bark beetle activity, again, the vast majority of time it is the stress responding bark beetles, not southern pine beetle, not the ones that we freak out about. So, and it can happen at any size. I see, longleaf pine this high, and I can find a single Ips gallery going through the inner bark. And pretty much any stand density, but it usually stays confined to the areas where the trees were burned. And usually in the areas where they're burned the worst. And just to again hammer this point home, I've been to stands where they knew that they had a fire get out of control. It kind of got loose, and they lost control of the intensity. And walking through the stand, bark beetle, bark beetle, bark beetle. Everywhere you go, there's trees infested with bark beetles showing pitch tubes. You find that point in the ground where the char marks stop, and they were able to stop the fire. Step over that line, not a single tree hit. So they are really keyed in on that scent of a tree in trouble, and they do not care about the healthy ones. Yeah.
Is there any research being done into pheromone usage as far as? Okay.
Yeah. So actually, one of the common prevention methods is they have a pheromone that we call the anti-aggregation pheromone that says this tree is full, go to the next one. You can actually put that on trees and repel pine bark beetles if you've already got an issue. Good question. So we say don't try to get in there and control this. If it's so bad that you can't afford to lose any more trees, consider clear cut, but don't try to pick and choose, right? So in the past, we've done a lot of work after wildfires, looking at what predicts pine bark beetle activity after wildfire. And these are the factors that tended to kind of pop up when we're looking for correlations. Things like heavy crown scorch by itself, not a big issue, but maybe in combination, it can be an indicator in combination with some other factors that the fire was stressful. Stem char and how high up the tree it goes can be a good predictor. Even better, though, is whether you've got resin weeping through the bark, indicating that the interior tissues were cooked, disrupted, and it starts to spill out. Those same resin vessels that are running through as a defense mechanism will tend to spill out through the outer bark. And the presence of wagon wheeling down at the base of the tree is often a good predictor. So and I will also say, if you find light-colored wood dust down at the base of pine trees after fire, that is generally going to be not from the pine bark beetles, but from ambrosia beetles. And so this is another reason I hate it when people say I've got pine beetles. Man, when a tree dies, it is on. The dinner bell has rung, and you've got dozens of species that come in from miles around because that is the stuff. I would say there's a lot of species that will feed on a live pine, but there's way more that will feed on a dead pine, and this is one of them. The ambrosia beetles that feed on pines in our area, they tunnel in to the wood, they push out wood dust behind them because they're not eating the tree. They're carrying in a symbiotic fungus, and they inoculate the dead wood with that fungus. It spreads through and it grows on the walls of their tunnels. So they're fungus farmers, and they just graze on the growth of this fungus inside their tunnels. But the reason that's useful to know is that when you see this light-colored fluffy wood dust, it tells you that part of the tree died because the ambrosia beetles will find it. If you see it all the way around the circumference, okay, that tree's toast. It's not going to come back, even if it looks green at the moment. The beetles are telling you that it's done. Sometimes you might see just one side hit and this tree might recover. So putting all this together, we have this thing we call the fire card for use by our field staff, where it basically gives some of these criteria and as sort of a rough guide of how much mortality to expect in a stand after a wildfire. Things like, if the bark char is greater than 3/4 of the height of the tree, that's a bad sign. If you have 100% crown scorch and it doesn't grow back after 2 months, bad sign. And then there are some kind of less bad signs where if you have two or more of them in combination, that might predict it. Like, if you've got bark char that's more than halfway up and you've got resin weeping out of the bark all the way around the tree, probably not going to make it. So, but again, this is for wildfires. So what about prescribed fire? I've seen a whole bunch of scenarios where we appear to have pine bark beetle activity in a stand that seemed to have a good burn. The bark char wasn't super high up in the stem, not a lot of resin weeping, no wagon wheeling, and yet we have trees dropping out. So this is from one of those cases in Madison County a year or so ago. A lot of times when we look, by the time we get there, we may see evidence of old Ips engraver beetle activity, but a year or so afterwards, you're starting to get some of the other beetles, those weird bark beetles that nobody knows about, because they don't attack living trees. They come in after the tree is dead. So again, this isn't a beetle outbreak. This is a tree stress event leading to that the beetles are responding to. So what predicts that? There's been some interesting studies on this. This is from a 2003 study. So don't focus too much on the numbers here, but basically the story is that they burned very similar mature, thinned longleaf pine stands under different conditions that would lead to more intense heat at the ground level, otherwise identical. And what they found was none of these stands showed unusual stem char or crown scorch or anything like that. But the ones that showed the highest mortality in pine bark beetle afterwards were the ones where the fire was, the conditions were most severe for the fire. And what they found that related to was the temperature at the soil surface and the amount of duff consumption that occurred during the fire. So it appears to be much more about what's happening down in the fine root zone of these trees than it is direct fire damage in these prescribed fire situations where you have mortality to pick up. And other groups have, some of you may have read some work by Varner and others. Other groups have basically corroborated this whole idea. It's all about the duff consumption with prescribed burns. That really seems to predict how much mortality in pine bark beetles you're going to have after a burn. So this is some studies that they did. So the upper graph shows that spike in temperature as the fire was running through. They continued monitoring temperature in the duff layer throughout the night and found that when there's a lot of duff consumption, it would actually get worse over the night as more and more of that duff was consumed and smoldered over time. And that has the really bad effects on the tree that tends to leave them vulnerable to attack. So what about southern pine beetle? Mixed results on this. Back in Texas, and I believe it was the 1980s, they had a lot of southern pine beetle activity, and they looked to see were they getting attacked more or less if those stands had recently been burned. In this case, they actually found that the recently burned stands were more likely to be attacked by southern pine beetle. So this could be because again, it's a short-term stress. Southern pine beetle is kind of a wimpy beetle in small numbers. It needs to get started on a compromised tree, and then it may spread from there. So maybe those prescribed burns were causing enough of those scattered stress trees to allow them to get a foothold. However, you need to put that into context. Texas at that time was having the kind of southern pine beetle outbreak that people like me have nightmares about. It was massive and overwhelming. We still use their aerial pictures as like our classic examples of the worst possible southern pine beetle outbreaks. So there were a ton of southern pine beetle out there all the time, looking for any place to get started. And I've certainly seen this too. So this is 2023 in the Apalachicola National Forest. I saw on the spreadsheet from the National Forest guys that they had recorded southern pine beetle on very low density longleaf pine. And I was like, that's just wrong. They got it wrong. So I drove 3 hours. I hiked an hour through the wood through head high smilax, and I got out to the stand. And I saw dead pines. I was like, this is going to be Ips. These guys are dumb. But they were right. It was southern pine beetle in these trees. However, number one, again, we were having southern pine beetle activity in that area at that time. That year was that was our hot spot for southern pine beetle that year. And these trees, man, those national forest guys, they just burned the heck out of them. We had huge scars at the base, and they just went nuts. And so each one of these little patches of pines was a perfect little spot for a southern pine beetle to get started and move around because there were so many of them already flying around. And so more recent evidence has found that looking at other examples of southern pine beetle outbreaks has found that it can be an advantage actually to have been recently burned in the past 2 to 6 years, especially. That seems to reduce the likelihood that your stand is going to get hit by southern pine beetle. And that may be because of, as I mentioned, southern pine beetle uses smells to coordinate their attack. So that the first one gets there, releases smells saying, come and join the party, and they all mass attack the same tree and overwhelm its defenses. This works much better when there's in a dense, sheltered stand where the air doesn't move around a whole lot. If you've got good airflow, those pheromones tend to be swept away. If you've got less competition, those trees are happier and healthier, better able to resist beetle attacks. So this could be why there's a benefit also seen. So the takeaways: prescribed fire is good for stand health and can create a better bark beetle resistance, but in the short term, it can be a higher risk, especially associated with duff consumption causing damage to the fine roots. But you really need to know which species you've got at work. Normally, you're going to find the stress responding species, Ips and black turpentine beetle, and they are responding to the event. We don't recommend you go in and try to control them. Whereas with southern pine beetle, very rare circumstances that you may find that, then you may want to get in there and consider a suppression harvest. So that's my thing. By the way, we've got this Southern Forest and Tree Health Diagnostics Facebook group. If you're not on it, you'd be welcome. We talk about this stuff all the time.
Oh, okay. So we've got a few minutes for questions. What is bugging you?
Oh,
Come on, you know something. Ben, way in the back.
well, I'm sorry. Good question. Are those salvage trees sellable for timber? Usually, if they have been attacked by beetles, the mills won't take them. They call it beetle wood. Even though generally the fungi that they carry are not decay fungi, they may take it for pulp, but generally not for saw timber. You sell very often. You're selling them at a loss or just getting them off site. But hopefully, it's not a major outbreak here because sometimes the mills do get glutted with beetle wood, and they'll start turning it away, and then it becomes an actual out-of-pocket cost for the landowner. That's another option. I didn't go through all the options, but yeah, cut and burn is another option. Yeah. So yeah.
Next question.
We got a guy here actually. He's been real patient.
Beetles have location specificity. However, if the timber's laying on the ground, do they behave the same way?
Great question. So the black turpentine beetle I mentioned only attacks near the base. If you lay it down, it will still only attack on the widest part of the tree because it's not the height that matters. It can fly for miles. It can fly for way up high. It's the thickness of the inner bark layer. That it's a big beetle and needs a thicker inner bark layer to fit through.
Southern pine beetle will still thrive in between the plates and the.
So interesting thing. Part of the reason we tell people if they can't remove the tree, just lay them down. Southern pine beetle does not like to attack trees that are laid down. I mean, it cues in on the visual profile of a standing tree. So another option is we call it cut and leave, where you lay down the trees towards the center of the spot, and they will often just skip over it.
Just quick, real quick, yes.
Is the aerial pesticide application not work?
So obviously there are some legal and regulatory issues with that, but also it just doesn't provide good enough coverage. If you're going to try to control bark beetles with insecticides, you've got to thoroughly coat the bark to the point of runoff. And also, I will say we don't have any that work against southern pine beetle. It's immune to our normal choices. So.